had another one of those spur-of-the-moment insights that I've actually turned into a blog post, which I will link in the description below, but I want to also break it out into a separate discussion here because it really fits in the theme of the channel. It all started with a fellow writer who was venting frustration about the construction of the middle of their story. Now, most anyone who writes knows about what's called the muddle of the middle. And it's the way everything from about the 20% mark to the 70% mark feels like this swamp that you could just end up losing a boot in. And out of nowhere, I came up with a theory as to why this tends to be the case. And again, I think it has a lot to do with science fiction and fantasy storytelling. See, the way I see a story is a little bit like one of those picnic kits, the kind you unzip and you've got all the little subcontainers inside of them. Now, you get the kit at the start of the story, but you don't really open it and start unpacking everything in it until about the 20 or 25% mark. And then when you're unpacking it, you use the middle of the story, that big stretch in the middle, to find out all of the dimensions and complications that are in the story. So it's not just about getting through the plot, it's about discovering what each of these things that's coming through by way of the plot means. So to my analogy, you're not just taking each container out of the kit, which is the plot, but you're opening them up and you're tasting them to see what they're like, which is your theme. So that's how I've thought about the middle stretch. It's this process of discovering what's really going on in your story, what's really happening, what it really all means, and how that changes everything irreversibly a step at a time. You open the kit, you start taking each one of these things out, and by the time everything's out of the kit, you're then at the point where the story is going to go into its climax, because everything's been laid out for how the conclusion is supposed to happen. Now, I know a few other writers who have the same problems with their middles, and when I've talked to them about their stories, it always seems to me that the problem is that they just don't use the middle as an arena for all the things that the story is going to bring up. There may be stuff happening, but those things that are happening aren't about unpacking that picnic kit and seeing what's really in those boxes. There may be some exploration, but there isn't necessarily discovery. And as a side note, I always feel like that's a chief culprit of why there are certain stories where you feel like there's just one thing happening after another, but there's no real logical progression or connective tissue. It's just stuff. It's because there's exploration but no discovery. So the way all this relates to science fiction and fantasy is SF and fantasy tend to be about the one big idea, the big what if. And with every one of those big what ifs, you get a whole bunch of other little what ifs that all have implications that branch outwards from it. And any story where you're not taking that big what if and unpacking all of those little what ifs, every time you don't do that, you're leaving things on the table, or maybe more to my analogy, you're leaving things in the picnic basket. So here's an example from a work in progress. I'm going to try to avoid spoilers. I'm going to keep things fairly generic, but you should be able to get the idea of what I'm talking about through it. The story is about a refugee. It's about someone who fled his masters, as he was created to be a slave, to find a better life amongst his fellow escaped biological slaves. And the whole middle stretch of the story, the 20 to the 70, so to speak, that's about him discovering all of the implications of going on this quest. So he's made it to the promised land. In fact, that's pretty much how the story opens. But what does it really mean for him to try and find a place there? It turns out to be more complicated. As each of the elements of his being there get unpacked, we see that there is a lot more difficulty and complication than he first realizes. And he finds companionship. But what does it mean for him to find companionship there? How does that change his sense of self-worth? Does he still think of himself as someone who's not worthy of love, for instance, which is a tough thing for a lot of people? And he also works his way up through the power structure. But what does that mean when he finds that the more you involve yourself with incumbent power, the harder it is to question that power without a cost, and so on? So for each thing that happens, each one of these things that comes out of the picnic kit that gets opened up and tasted in every single scene, there's an accompanying implication. There's an accompanying insight. So that's what it means. And because each of these revelations is transformative and irreversible, the previous insights are going to lead into new ones. Every scene in a story is about something irreversible happening. And so, of course, is the whole story itself. It's about how all of these little irreversibles add up to one big one. But more than that, it's also about the never the same beat twice. Each of the things that you take out of the picnic container is a separate container. And in fact, it can't be the same for any two of them. The same beat early in a story, if you repeated it later in the story, it's not going to land the same way. It's not going to have the same implications because everything's shifted. That's why each of these picnic containers are separate boxes. So the more I thought about this particular metaphor, the more I feel like it has real implications for people who are writing fiction with a fantastic element to it. Because whenever you have something in there that is a big what if, you don't want to leave opportunities for what it will do to your story or for your story. You don't want to leave those opportunities on the table or in the picnic basket. You want to take them out. You want to open them all the way up. And that requires a degree of fearlessness. That requires being able to say, this could conceivably disrupt all of the previous ideas that I had about this story, where it was supposed to go, what it was supposed to add up to, what it was going to do to my characters. You have to be able to look that stuff in the eye. Because if you don't, there's a good chance that everything that your story really needs to be about, especially, again, when you're exploring something of the fantastic, there's a good chance that you're going to miss it. There's a good chance that you're going to have only a 1/2 or a 2/3 exploration of something that really needs to go all the way to 100%. So if you've got a story in progress right now and you're feeling stuck in the middle and it's a science fiction or fantasy story, think about what's in that picnic basket. Think about what's really in there. Think about how to open that all the way up. Think about how to take each one of these things out and open them all the way up and see where that brings you. Because that may bring you to a very, very different place than what you had originally in mind when you started all this off. And you know what? That's a good thing. That's a powerful thing. Stare it in the eye. See what you think.